Hey guys, it's Gregory from Epsilon Omicron here, and we're going to go through the basics of Robert's Rules today. So what are Robert's Rules? Robert's Rules of Order are a type of parliamentary law. So parliamentary law or parliamentary procedure is really like a system in which allows for people to have discussions in a way that safeguards fairness and efficiency. So parliament comes from the old French verb meaning to speak. Parliamentary law can then be thought of as the law of speaking. So all that stuff is laws governing how we speak in a group. Robert's Rules then are laws governing speech and behavior. So the deliberative assembly. Gatherings or meetings which use parliamentary law are known as a deliberative assembly. A deliberative assembly also has the following basic characteristics. It is a group of people meeting to determine courses of action to be taken in the name of the entire group. And that's important to note because that means everything you're doing is something that you guys are deciding to do as an organization or as a larger group. It's things that are well thought out and very clear in what they intend to do. In any decision made, the opinion of each member present has equal weight as expressed by a vote. So that's just all people who are part of the deliberative assembly are equal to each other. So the Robert's Rules of Order is really for fair and orderly meetings and conventions. It's kind of the underlying principle or philosophy of the law of speaking. And Robert's Rules provides common rules and procedures for deliberation and debate in order to place the whole membership on the same footing and speaking the same language. So again, going back to its kind of underlying principles being for fair and orderly meetings, so efficiency and making sure the rights of the majority and the minority are somewhat balanced. And speaking the same language means, that's really going to the efficiency aspect, just, safeguarding, kind of keeping things going so we don't have meetings that start at 5 and end at 11. All business is controlled by the general will of the whole membership. So how you guys deal with stuff, it's not just the president dictating that or anything. It's how the whole group is deciding to handle something. And that means the right of the deliberate majority to decide things. So the majority of the group, after having really talked something through, may still making the decision, having the power to make the decision for the entire group. And complementary to the right is of the at least a strong minority to require the majority to deliberate. And that's just meaning that the minority can force the majority to at least talk about something before they decide to do it. So the majority can't just say, we want to do this and we're going to do it. And the minority is allowed to say, well, we want to talk it through pretty fully before we decide to do something at all. Okay, so participating in the deliberative assembly. So how do you participate in your chapter meetings, and then under these laws of speaking? So the main method members of an assembly use to express themselves is called a motion, and that's just a bit of that's terminology, vocabulary specific to these laws of speaking. So a motion is really just a proposal that the entire membership or the whole chapter group takes some sort of specific action or specific stance on something. Individual members can also, in addition to making a motion, they can second motions, they can debate motions, and they can vote on the motions. So outside of that, those are the only things you're really allowed to do legally under these laws of speaking. There are 4 basic types of motions. Main motions. The purpose of a main motion is to introduce items to the membership for their consideration. They cannot be made when any other motion is on the floor. They yield to privileged, subsidiary, and incidental motions, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. But it's essentially a main motion is the first thing you're ever going to do. It's the core, the foundation to the action the deliberative assembly is trying to take. So privileged, subsidiary, and incidental motions come after a main motion or on top of a main motion. And don't necessarily direct that the group take any sort of specific action outside of its conduct as a delivered assembly. The main motion is really what's saying, let's take this action. Subsidiary motions, their purpose is to change or affect how a main motion is handled and is voted on before a main motion. So that's something related to the main motion, and it's not something different. So you can't do a subsidiary motion for something that isn't relevant to the main motion that is currently on the floor. It just means whatever you guys are talking about at that moment. Privileged motions, their purpose is to bring items that are urgent or special, important matters unrelated to pending business. So that means you guys are talking about a main motion, which could be something like, let's have a rush on Friday. And, it's not a subsidiary motion because it's what you want to do is not relevant to wanting to do a rush on Friday. But it's something urgent like, I have a phone call I have to take. May I step out? And that would be called a point of privilege specifically, and is under in a category that is called privileged motions. This can also be something like calling for the order of the day, which means that you think you've gotten off track of the agenda and you want to go back to that. We'll talk about the agenda a little later in this too. But those are examples of privileged motions. Subsidiary motions, an example of those would be something like I move that we make the rush on Saturday instead of Friday. So it's related to the main motion because it's still about the rush, but you want to change some specific aspect of the motion. Incidental motions provides a means of questioning procedure concerning motions and must be considered for the other motions. So that means just, it doesn't happen a lot, but it just means something that came up that's like a specific Robert's Rules thing on the main motion. Some vote wasn't correct. Maybe it needed to be a 2/3 majority instead of a simple majority. And you can question that procedure and say something in regards to that and have that reconsidered. And then you go back and you start from before that issue had taken place. Not very common. You guys probably wouldn't run into it in your average chapter meeting. This is called the order of precedence. This is motions that are considered more urgent than ones that are below it. So as you can see at the bottom is bringing the main motion. It's the foundation. That's the first thing you're going to bring up. But the motion to kill that main motion could be made, and that would take precedence. That means you discuss killing the motion before you discuss the actual motion. Similar to that, something saying let's limit debate would be higher than let's refer this to a committee. And you can go through this list on your own. It's available on My Symphonia. Now, these are motions that are, like we talked about earlier, a little bit different than a subsidiary or a main motion. These are incidental motions and arise incidentally and decided immediately, which means they have a higher precedence than everything else. They have to be addressed then. And then we have motions that bring a question before the assembly. No order of precedence, introduced only when nothing else is pending. That's things like instead of making a new motion, you say, hey, let's reconsider a motion we made earlier. Or instead of going on to something new, you're like, I don't like what we just did. Let's cancel that action. And these would be things that were brought up essentially around the same time that a main motion could be brought up. And again, this is available on My Symphonia as well. One thing I'd like to go back to here on the first slide is the top bar, which says you want to, giving the action that you would like to do, how you would say it in the law of speaking, so how you would say it in Robert's Rules. Can it be interrupted? Does it require a second? That is, for a main motion to be considered, debated, or move on to a vote, it has to be seconded first. So at least one other person has to at least agree that what you're talking about should be discussed at the very least. Is it debatable? That is, after it is seconded, can there be a time of debate where people get to voice their opinions on why or why not they think you should vote yes or no for this? Is it amendable? That is, can someone make a subsidiary motion to which, it can be modified or something else can be added. And then the type of vote required, as outlined in general by Robert's Rules, though your bylaws or specific procedures in place for your chapter could specify a different level of voting. So that could change, but more or less on this, you see what Robert's Rules generally says should be used. So whether it be the majority vote, no vote at all, or a 2/3 majority. So how are motions presented? Or you could say, so when can I talk? Obtaining the floor. Wait until the last speaker is finished, so don't speak when anyone else is talking. Raise your hand and address the presiding officer, or the chair, by saying Mr. President in our case, because the chair is typically the chapter president. Wait until the presiding officer recognizes you, so wait until the president calls on you. And then, so if the president is called on you, how do you make your motion? You speak in a clear and concise manner, because this does need to be recorded word for word in the minutes. Always state the emotion affirmatively. Say, I move that we, or I move to, rather than I move that we do not. So just avoid negatives. And then avoid personalities and stay on subject. Motions are really the only thing that Robert's Rules specifies really has to be recorded in the minutes. And motions need to be recorded exactly as stated, because that wording is really important, because that wording specifies the specific action the entire chapter is going to take. So, after you've stated your motion in a clear and concise way, you wait for someone to second your motion. Another member will second your motion, or the presiding officer will call for a second if no one else immediately seconds your motion. If there is no second, though, your motion is lost. The presiding officer, after someone seconded your motion, will say it has been moved and seconded that we, then the exact text of your motion, and this places your motion before the assembly or the membership for consideration and action, so debate or vote. The membership then either debates the motion or may move directly to a vote. For debate, the presiding officer will ask if there is any discussion. If there is no debate, the presiding officer will skip debate and call for a vote in one of a few prescribed ways. Once the motion is presented to the membership by the presiding officer, it becomes assembly property and cannot be changed without the consent of the members. So that means that once you've stated the exact wording of your motion and the presiding officer has said it's been moved and seconded and placed it before the assembly, you can't say, oh, no, I meant to say this or I meant to say that. People now have to vote, I move to amend the statement to say this, and then there's a whole debate process and then a voting process on that just to change the wording. So that's why it's really important that when you state your motion, you really know what you want to say and you're speaking in a clear and concise way and have a very well-formed thought. So now expanding on your motion after it's been put before the assembly. This is the time for you to speak in favor of your motion, and don't talk about why you think you should be doing the action you're specifying in your motion or your personal experience or anything. You don't have to make an argument for it. You're just saying this is what I think we should do. And then once it's put before the assembly and it's time for debate, this is when you can elaborate and say, hey, this is why I think we should do this, or this has been my experience with this, and that's why I think we should take this action. This is your chance to essentially go into depth. And the mover always has the right to speak first. So when you making the motion means you get to be the first person to speak. All comments in debate must be directed to the presiding officer, meaning no comment can be made at the mover. That means that someone can't turn to you and say, hey, I don't like this about the motion. I think we should do this, or I think we should do that. They have to say, Mr. President, I think we should do this, or I think we should do that. And then the president will say, or you'll have heard it. But it just means keeps personalities out of it. It makes debate not between two people, but between like the person and then the whole group. So no statements get personal is the reason that this is the convention and kind of tradition that constitutes this law of speaking. And then you want to keep the time limited. Sometimes there'll be an established time, sometimes there won't be. You can set that at some point during the debate with a subsidiary motion, or maybe your chapter has some type of time limit for debate written into your bylaws. And if you don't, and you think that'd be something you want to do, you could do that as well. And then you could just change that as needed. The mover, after speaking for the first time, can only speak again after other speakers are finished, unless called upon by the presiding officer. The presiding officer could say, like, hey, we need clarification on this point. Do you mind speaking to this again? And you could do that. You could speak to that before someone else who wants to speak on this issue has spoken, but only if the presiding officer is specifically called on you. And the presiding officer will usually do this based off comments made by someone who was speaking earlier that would seem to be benefited by you speaking to the issue again. So, putting the question to the membership, just some Robert's Rules terminology to mean, are you ready to vote? And the motion will sometimes be called a question, so when it says question here, that's what it means. Are you ready to vote on the motion? If there is no more discussion, that's when a vote is taken. So voting on a motion. The method of vote on any motion depends on the situation and the bylaws of your organization. There are 5 methods used to vote by most organizations. If no method is specified for this particular motion or in the bylaws as how you vote on all main motions, general consent is the default method. And that means the speaker will say it's been moved and seconded that, for example, we have a rush on Friday. Are there any opposed? Seeing and hearing none, the motion passes. So that's general consent. It's essentially just saying, hey, if you don't agree, say something. So it's a way to vote by a majority of 100%. So only one person has to disagree for the motion to have to go to some other method of voting. So that's why it's normally considered the default, because this way if everyone agrees, it's probably doesn't need any debate or discussion. So here are the common methods of voting. By voice, or sometimes called acclamation, the presiding officer asks those in favor to say aye, those opposed to say no or nay. And then any member can move for an exact count. And the reason you might want to move for an exact count in this is that the way the ayes or the nays win is simply by who the president thought was louder. And the president would normally announce the result of this vote by saying the ayes have it or the noes have it. That meaning he heard one of those groups to be louder. If you do go for an exact count, you can do by roll call, which means you call down the roster for the group. The secretary will call the name. For example, the secretary could say Anthony Savitt, and then Anthony Savitt would say aye or no, and then they would move on to the next member calling another name, and then that member giving a or nay, no, whatever you want to do. This method is usually used when each specific person's vote is wanting to be recorded, like you want to know how everyone voted. So you don't always have to do this, but it is a proper way to vote under Robert's Rules. So general consent, like we went over earlier, is when a motion is not likely to be opposed. The presiding officer says if there is no objection, the membership shows its agreement by their silence. However, if one member says I object, the item must be put to a different type of vote. So you have by division. This is a slight verification of the voice vote. It does not require a count unless the presiding officer so desires. Members raise their hands or stand. So that means it's like the acclamation A or nay. Aye or nay. Those in favor stand, and then those opposed stand or raise their hands, and then the president simply determines which group had more people standing or raising their hands. So it's like the voice vote, just silent. So then you have by ballot. Members should write their vote on a slip of paper. This method is used when secrecy is desired, so this is something that would be good for your probationary member votes. Then yeah, should a secret vote be desired by the chapter, the warden should usually preside over it. So earlier, we talked about how Robert's Rules was a fantastic way to make sure your meetings were orderly and efficient. And one of the great tools for that is the agenda. You should always have a great agenda for your meetings. It really helps you stay structured and make it through the meeting in a timely fashion and stay on topic. So the agenda I am going to be pulling up is the one, it's omitting a few things, but it's essentially what Nationals lists as a good sample meeting agenda under our officer resources on My Symphonia. So the first item on that agenda is organization, and that will start with some pretty basic stuff like a call to order, a roll call, an approval of the agenda, and the meetings from the last, or the minutes from the last meeting. The president will typically call the meeting to order, but anyone can really do it. The president will typically, since it's on the agenda, doesn't need a motion to bring up the discussion. The president will simply move to the roll call and ask the secretary to call the roll. The secretary at that point should take roll either by calling the names of each member and then getting a verbal present, or doing it by simply observing. However, your whatever size your chapter is, it's really up to your secretary. But some type of roll should be recorded. Next, this is the first item that really requires a motion. Someone should motion to approve the agenda, and then that requires a second. You could debate it, but it would be unlikely. And then you should vote. This would be a good example of when, if you have a good agenda, when general consent would be a great method of voting for this. And then similarly, you have approving the minutes from the last meeting. That is usually a pretty easy vote as well. Still requires a motion. Someone needs to move to approve the minutes from the meeting on the specific day. Then it needs to be seconded. Likely no debate. So thus general consent would be a great method of voting for this. So next is officer reports. Officer reports are a really great way to kind of update people on what's going on. So they're kind of like chapter status reports. These are the officers that I selected and I thought were pretty relevant and maybe useful to get an update from at the meeting. The sample agenda from My Symphonia lists most of the officers under officer reports, but I think this group is a pretty good group to get reports from. President more on the general state of the chapter. Secretary could maybe report attendance of members, absences and such. Treasurer should always give a report at chapter meetings and state the chapter finances at that time. The fraternal education officer should probably give a report on the probationary process. And then the alumni relations officer should probably give a report on what the alumni association is doing, or if alumni are planning on attending events. Next, we have committees. Most chapters should have a committee. It's a pretty efficient way to get something done outside of the full chapter meeting. It allows a couple separate people to go get some information about stuff or figure some stuff out without having to do it in the form of a motion and then debate and then all of the parliamentary procedure that goes along with a chapter meeting. So they're a pretty efficient way to get something done. So the two example committees I put in this agenda are the fundraising committee and social committee, and then the reports for these committees, essentially their status updates, should be given by the chairs of those committees. Next, we have unfinished business. This is when specific motions were potentially laid on the table or not being able to be finished because of time. So you want to come back to something that has already been moved previously in a different meeting, or maybe in the last meeting or a couple meetings ago. It's usually what's called on the table. That means that someone during that previous meeting had moved to lay something on the table to be discussed later. And then the later time that one would be discussing this is in unfinished business. This isn't a time to discuss what happened at the last meeting or what happened at the last event night or rush. This is to take specific action on things that have been brought up earlier, but could be postponed until they need to be brought up again. So new business is when new motions can be brought up or new action can be brought up that needs to be done by the chapter. So this can be either put in the agenda beforehand, as in something that you know is going to be coming up, but the chapter hasn't discussed it before, so this is its first time being introduced, so you can put it under new business within the agenda. And then this is also the time that any member can make a new main motion. That's something, if something comes to mind, this is the time to make your main motion. So new business should really be the first time, if you don't have a lot of unfinished business, that anyone in the chapter is actually making motions. Before this, it should have just been a few motions to approve procedural things and then reports from either committees or officers. Next, you have what I've added, and Robert's Rules defines, or this is the term Robert's Rules kind of uses. It's called an open forum. So this is the time in your meeting when you might want to talk about how you guys felt about how the last rush event went or the last event night went. This is more of a discussion time, and nothing needs to be made as a motion, and it's just a time for people to make statements that are of opinion, and not calling for specific actions for the chapter to take. Just saying how they thought something went or giving their opinion on something. This is the time. This is also the time that chapters might want to make their BP or SD discussions. So the open forum, that's the term Robert's Rules uses. It's usually traditionally placed towards the end of the meeting to help with efficiency, so you only discuss before things that the chapter needs to get done, instead of discussing how you thought something went before you talk about what you actually need to do this week. So that means if your meetings start running long, the discussion of just how we felt about something is cut. But hopefully earlier in the meeting we got all the actual business done, or people got the updates they needed from the officers or the committees. Next we have adjournment. So someone just moves to end the meeting, and it gets a second. You could debate it, but usually moves to a general consent vote or some other type of voting. If people are maybe not quite wanting to adjourn, but that's rare. But yeah, adjournment. So thank you guys. Hopefully you'll get some help from this. Feel free to message me and ask me any questions if you want, and hopefully I can maybe explain it a little bit better to maybe a specific question you have or whatever. Feel free to reach out. And then if you want to get the order of precedence charts or the sample meeting agenda, again, those resources are available on My Symphonia. So yeah, thank you guys. Stay safe.